Life is uncertain. It's okay to feel stressed, anxious, worried, or frustrated. CalHope can help. Access CalHope's free and secure mental health resources. Call 833-317-4673 or live chat at calhope.org. Oscast.
Hello world, I'm John Bruni and you're listening to Strategikon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. In this episode of Strategikon, we'll be trying something a little risky technology-wise, tying up 3 different locations internationally. Joining us today is the team at Austability, a company our listeners will be familiar with, especially 2 of our speakers, David Khandan and Sandy Wade, who have been on Strategikon before, talking about Australian security, the Horn of Africa and Ethiopian politics. David will be joining us from Dubai, the United Arab Emirates, and Sandy and his colleague Don Randall will be joining us from the United Kingdom. Our other speaker from Austability is Mark Smethurst, who will be joining us from Canberra. Mark is a former Australian Army Special Forces Brigadier, so we'll have quite a bit of security heft on hand to tackle today's topic, which is COVID-19's transformation of the international security order. Also joining us in the studio today is co-host David Olney. Hello, David.
Hey, John.
And our producer, Tim Whiffen. Hello, Tim.
Thank you very much for having me, John.
Before we start today's episode, I'd like to remind listeners that Strategikon can be found on the Ozcast network, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, and on the Sage International Australia website, www.sageinternational.org.au. Gentlemen, if I can kick things off with this observation. We are living in a world unlike the pre-COVID-19 one, where, imperfect as it was, there was a modicum of order and Trumpian disruptions notwithstanding, some predictability in the behaviour of international leaders and states. There was an expectation that leaders and states would behave rationally at some level. The COVID-19 world has upturned these expectations. What do you think have been the most critical issues we've faced since January 2020? In your opinion, will things get better or worse before the year is out? I'll leave the floor open.
Okay, let me lead off perhaps. Sandy Wade, I think, John, it's too early to say what the changes are going to be because we're still in a position where it's unclear whether we're going to fall back into some of our old ways as we become comfortable with some slight changes to how we do things in what may be the short term. In Britain, the shops are opening again today, and that's going to make a big difference to what's happening, and it's going to give people a feeling of going back to normality rather than forward into something else, perhaps. You talked about what's the biggest challenge been since January. I think the clear stress on the international rules-based, ordered system of interaction between nations. The WHO, as an example, has come under a lot of pressure by many states to be something that perhaps it isn't and was never meant to be. So I think that's been one of the fundamental challenges.
David?
I agree with everything that Sandy said. I look at things as the human race, we have a tendency to evolve. We evolve when we're faced with challenges, meaning we come up with different strategies, different ways of doing things. I don't know if this is the right thing to say or not, because there's a lot of heavy price has been paid by a lot of people, particularly those that have died. However, I think COVID-19 has shook up our world unlike anything we've ever seen before. And we will come out of it stronger. Things will change by the end of the year, I feel, in a positive manner. It has made us think about things that we never did before. And I don't think things will become the new norm, if you like, whether it's working from home, whether it's having that workplace flexibility, and a number of things that we have been, because we were forced to do it, now we're actually starting to see the positives out of it. And I think going into 2021, it'll be a different world, in my opinion.
Okay. I think if I could add, John, it's Don.
So, there you are. Yep, gotcha.
I think we will see the world unite. The sad death of George Floyd has shown how the world will unite, albeit in a hostile way in some locations. You know, we saw that before with the climate change issues. I think what we have to be conscious of is the things still festering in the background. And we've seen that here in the United Kingdom in the last 2 weeks. The far right are a very powerful organisation, and you've seen their activities in London over this weekend and the weekend before. So I think David and Sandy are not wrong. There will be change, there will be unity, but equally there'll be independence. And of course, the one thing with the COVID-19, to deal with that medically, whichever nation you're in, but the economy piece is a completely different subject. Yeah? I mean, you're going to get the rollout from COVID-19. There's big debates in this country at the moment. Literally in the last hour, the Prime Minister is looking at reducing the 2 metres down to 1 metre because, frankly, the hospitality industry will die, bad word, if 3.5 million people will lose their jobs if we don't reduce from 2 to 1 metres, effectively 30% of business versus 70% business efficiency. So there's a lot of impacts. And the hostility side, I think we've been relatively lucky in the United Kingdom, weather-wise, because had we not had the good weather in May that we experienced, I think things would be different. And we've seen that in the last week when the weather turned again and people were cocooned even more. Even those, some of us have been very fortunate with gardens. But you live on the 15th floor of a high-rise block and you're confined. I mean, that's hard work. We know even travelling in a hotel is hard work. So I think there's a lot of learning, and we mustn't lose sight of the issues that are going to rise. I said way back in early March, there will be hostility when this comes out for a various number of reasons, because people will lose their jobs. The furloughing in this country will stop. The redundancies will occur. And the fundamentals in my mind of crime, which is either need, greed, or just desire, the need factor will be driving a lot of issues in basic people's lives to survive. So we do see change on the horizon.
Mark, you heard something?
It's a fascinating time, isn't it? In Australia, we've gone through some really horrendous effects of climate, particularly with the bushfires, but that's affecting globally. So if you take climate, COVID, Black Lives Matters, and the long-term financial issues, that could take 2 to 3 years to get back to full recovery. It really is something the globe hasn't seen for quite some time. You could probably go back in history to World War II to see the effects that it has had on people. But on the other hand, there are some parts of the community, and we're seeing it now as we try to find the new normal, where people are racing back to trying to have their lives as normal as possible, apart from those that are suffering high levels of unemployment. So we're seeing these changes happening probably more rapidly than we've ever seen. And if we go back to the start of COVID, some countries reacted very differently to others. The UK only closed their borders to foreign entry and put in quarantine periods a few weeks ago. Australia did it really early. US was pretty slow to do it. But now we're all almost on the same level of response. So I think what we're going to see is when we have people start to see second waves, the ability to deal with it will be far more rapid and far more capable. And people have now got a degree of resilience, which I think a lot of the communities didn't really have, apart from a lot of the Asian countries who have handled some other issues in the past very, very well. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how globally we start to come together and where we have the fractures. And there are parts of the globe now that are only just starting to get into the early days of COVID-19. So we're all on a different path of recovery. Hopefully we can work more closely together, but we're also seeing those points that aren't working as effectively as they probably should.
David, you had something?
Thanks. Yeah, I also sort of wanted to bring up a theoretical point that, around this time last year, Sean McFate released his book, Goliath, making the argument that we now live in a world of durable disorder, problems that can only be managed rather than being solved. And he got the reception we would expect from most of the Beltway in the US and most of the think tanks in the UK. And that was a large degree of skepticism. And yet COVID-19 has got a lot of people on board with this idea that we're now facing problems so thick and fast that all we can do now is manage them best as possible at the time and be ready for the next one. And I think we will get better behaviour out of this, but it won't be better behaviour because of sweetness and light. It will be better behaviour because the recognition will come that without interdependence, combating problems coming one after the other will just be too hard. And in terms of an economic recovery, if we really look post-GFC, stock market got back to high levels, but the economy has never really stabilised again. And it's taken huge amounts of constant effort across the world to get it back to that point where markets are high, even though actual economies are shaky. So to add this huge hit now, I think, will reinforce this idea too, that if we want any kind of stability, it will require constant effort from multiple players. So rather than it being the old thing of just ease into long-term alliances and take them for granted, I think this is a situation where alliances have to be much more about being on the front foot and being proactive and getting ahead of these problems. And in that, we might find that we're far more capable as, you know, a world of different cultures and societies and states than we have been historically.
Tim?
It's been really fascinating to see just from the kind of civil discussions out there about the kind of really nuanced discussion about what freedom is, and seeing some really mainstream arguments from freedom from and freedom to's. It's been really interesting thinking about that, how people want the, you know, freedom to go out to the pub, and then others are seeking kind of freedom from exposure to the virus, and how that's kind of played out in the public sphere. But even better than that, I think, has been the discussion of sovereign capability, which hasn't been named that in our media here, but has been the opportunity for think tanks like you guys and academics to kind of hop into this space and expose sovereign capability in a way that the public will now accept, as it has been brought to their attention, to the forefront.
I just want to raise an issue that I read something on earlier this morning about markets, and the international markets seem to not be suffering as much as would be expected under current conditions. If you're looking at Wall Street, it seems to be bubbling along reasonably well, which gives people an impression that financially we will come out the other side, and we will come out the other side well. But today, the markets are very divorced from society. They're in their own space in Wall Street, doing their own thing. And I'm not so sure I can really buy into the whole trickle-down effect, you know, that whatever is good for Wall Street, whatever these guys are doing, which is the great unknown, that somehow some sort of financial benefits are going to secretly and magically appear and help national economies rebuild. I might be a skeptic, but I'd be interested to find out what everyone else thinks about that. Don and David.
Okay. I think the markets will always shift in order to go where the markets will do best. And when we look at investment funds, and we look at development and opportunity, you know, clearly airlines are a bit shaky at the moment. Rolls-Royce is shaky, but then you look at some of the other factors around the world, you know, that are strong. So the markets will always shift that way. But the other thing we've got to remember, I think, John and everybody, is that the interest rates are almost zero. Yeah, there's no competition. So effectively, you know, and if you listen to Andrew Bailey, who I had the privilege of working with a couple of years ago, the new governor of the Bank of England, says, yeah, well, we can provide the central bank funding for the government, yeah, but interbank dependency, it's all 0.25. You know, it's a quarter of a base rate. So you can borrow, you're not paying, you've got to pay back the capital, but you're paying very minimalistic interest. So I think from a central bank perspective, a market perspective, there isn't that much gloom and doom, but how you, in your words, John, how you trickle that down to the baseline economy is different. You know, we've got two things on the horizon, three things really. You've got the COVID-19, you've got the potential hostilities, and we've also got the exit from Europe to encounter as well, all of which can have market and trade functionality in a very short period of time. But at least the decisions have been made. Yes, the European decision has been made. The governor of the Bank of England has made the decision to support the UK government in the funding of their enormous lending to keep the British population afloat. So I think that's where the economy has come. you know, it's having worked at JP Morgan, having worked at the Bank of England, you know, not on the inside track, but you can just see how these functionalities work and how the influence works. And more importantly, John, how it's a fundamental necessity that these markets do sustain. I know you're going to get the little rich people comments, but they are the backbone of the world economy. And it's that very low interest rate, which is not going to change for some considerable time, which is the forward-thinking piece that will make that stability occur.
Last Friday night, I was really privileged. One of my colleagues, Pat Tyrrell, who must be a member of the Henry Jackson Society, invited me on to one of their webinars, and we had Neil Ferguson on. And just staying on the European piece for a second, and I'd like to get Don and Sandy's opinion on this. And it was the only thing that I really had a disagreement with Neil Ferguson on, and that is he believes that now that Brexit is a reality, that fiscal union for the continent now becomes a real thing. If that were to be the case, does this not fly in the face of other realities on the continent where people are not coming together? You know, we talk about COVID as the golden opportunity, you know, the COVID dividend where, you know, people will start throwing away their problems and come together to help solve this intractable issue that we're currently facing. But Europe is a mess. I mean, how can a fiscal union come together under these circumstances? David, I'll come to you in a second. Don and Sandy?
Sandy? Yeah, so Brexit is a reality. I think it has freed Europe. If one looks at it from the European side, Europe has been a bit freed now from some of the more fundamental discussions about how Britain was going to leave, and can now get on with a more constructive discussion about what the relationship is going to be. I think COVID has put real strain on the European system, on the union, as it were. But I see it having come out slightly stronger from that pressure than it might have come out had it been Brexit alone. Had it been Brexit alone, there might have been more divisions amongst the countries based on national interest on their individual deals with Britain. And I think that the need to be together over COVID, and we saw that with the eventual agreements on European packages to support all countries in Europe. Yeah, so I think I look at it as a bit of continuity. I really do hope that that the European Union stays together. I mean, I think Britain is going to be okay, whether it's in Europe, whether it's out of Europe. Europe needs to work hard to stay together. And I think COVID has been a bit of an opportunity for them to do that.
I'll go to Don and then David O.
Yeah, I endorse what Sandy said. I think what you have seen during the COVID period, you saw it in Italy and Spain, you've seen the uniting of the European Union, but you've seen the individuality of each of those countries, you know, both in their lockdowns and their processes. I mean, there hasn't been one European policy for COVID. Yes, there's been a European financial policy eventually emerged, but, you know, both from the lockdown perspective and the opening up perspective, you know, Italy, Greece. I mean, without being controversial, there's only three principal economies in Europe: Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. They were there, you know. The various other countries have been bailed out over a period of time. I'm with Sandy. I think what will also happen with Europe is that you'll see, by virtue of the issues that have been raised on supply chain manufacturing, that some of the initiatives in Asia and the Far East will actually migrate back to Europe, because, you know, if you're running a motor company now and you're dependent on a single part from China, should you actually be offsetting that risk by going somewhere else? And I think you'll see a lot of that supply chain fracture and become less dependent on Asia and the Far East and perhaps more centric to Europe. I also believe, as Sandy says, that the United Kingdom will survive. The biggest thing that happened was the uncertainty was removed. The principal uncertainty of in or out was removed, whether you're a Remainer or a non-Remainer, that was gone. All right, we had a little bit of uncertainty whether we get a trade deal. We will get a trade deal. We have to get a trade deal. Everybody wants a trade deal. So the uncertainty is diminishing. that's the good news. That's my a few words on that, John.
David O?
Just a few things, and they relate to everything that's been said. First of all, with interest rates, the fact that they're so low means that inevitably money is going to go in the market, and that this speculation will keep the money moving around. That's all very positive. The question then comes when and if interest rates rise, and there's really no reason for them to rise unless we're trying to control inflation. And at the moment, there's no reason to see inflation in the next few years. In terms of the EU, if we look at European behaviour during the GFC, they will go one of two ways. They will either punish the poor part of the EU with hardcore austerity and potentially break all these countries again, which whether they'll tolerate it again is a whole other question, or they'll move supply chains back from Asia and they'll put those supply chains in the countries they broke in 2008 and 2009, which is by far the preferable solution. But if they don't do that second thing and fairly quickly, the German banks were not in a good situation before this. And I'd have to imagine after the money that's been spent are even in a worse situation than they were. So they really need to make sure they do something very different to 2009.
Yes, Sandy, go ahead.
Yeah, David made an interesting point about punish there. During the Greek crisis, I remember talking to a Greek diplomat and saying, I hope that Europe is going to behave like a club and not a gang in its dealings with Greece. And I think at the time it didn't. It behaved as a gang and not a club. And what's the difference between the two? Imagine that you step out of line in a gentleman's club. You turn up in a pair of jeans. Somebody sidles up to you and says, can we lend you a pair of trousers? Imagine you step out of line in a gang. Somebody comes over and smacks you. It's a very different approach. And I think one of the things that I see changing now is a move towards a more club-like, more gentle approach by the European Commission, by the central European machine, to the countries, because they can see that they've probably pushed the envelope as far as they can in terms of demanding that people do things in a particular way. And if they want to continue as a union, then they need to be a bit more conciliatory in the way and a bit more club-like in the way they deal between the members of the club.
On to more security-related issues, but before we do that, David Kay, you've got something?
I just wanted to make a couple of comments on what we started on, the discussion about the financial recovery and whether the markets will come back in. The opinion that I have is that, ironically, for lack of a better word, the COVID-19, to my limited understanding of it, said it affects the elderly in terms of human beings and some with pre-existing medical conditions. I feel that it has done the same thing to businesses. What I mean by that is businesses with old mentalities and attitudes will not recover from this. Businesses that are not open to change and diversification will not recover from this. So some of those will die. But what it has also done, it has pushed us or catapulted us way into the future. For example, within the last year or two, if you were to speak to many law enforcement agencies, defense agencies, etc., and bring up the concept of augmented virtual reality training, some of these, the old colonels and with all respect, Mark, the brigadiers and everybody else that's on it, because it's an old method and it's a change. People are afraid of change, so they were not willing to embrace it. What I would see within the next 12 months or 2 years, particularly when it comes to security apparatus, they will have to embrace this. With travel restrictions being in place, Sandy and I are having a number of discussions with airlines such as Ethiopian Airlines, etc., and we're trying to bring them onto the idea of augmented virtual reality training or virtual training, etc. They'll have to start embracing it. That's from the Defence and National Security Agency perspective. So I think that might be a minor risk that we'll be facing there if they are slow off the starting block and in welcoming these changes. So that's one side. And from the financial side, if some of those old businesses do die, what this actually has done is created an opportunity for new businesses, particularly those around the cyber-based type of platforms, to actually grow and again catapult forward 2-3 years in advance, and those businesses will come out. Again, what that'll happen is that because these new opportunities are being presented, it will present opportunities for new waves of crime. So having businesses to be prepared to tackle what actually these new business opportunities will bring on is another challenge that, in my opinion, the world has got to open their eyes to. So it's not just, will Wall Street recover or not? It's a case of we've got to look at it as societies and see what are the businesses that are going to go out of business, the unemployment, everything else that will bring in civil unrest, crime, other levels that affects the society with it. What are the new businesses that are coming online that we're likely to see over the next 3 to 5 years? What are the security challenges they'll face? How do we deal with change management and so forth? I mean, this is a topic that can go on. And it goes back to my earlier comment, is that it'll change us for the better, because if we were going to see things like augmented virtual reality training fully implemented 5 years from now, you'll see that that'll be somewhere around 1.5 to 2 years from now. It must be, because we can't have our national security operators or defense agency operators do their combined exercises. For example, one of the areas that we work with in Oman, one of the military bases with the US, they on yearly basis they hold 3 or 4 military exercises where they come in and conduct that. Now there is restrictions on base access, international travel that must still be conducted, because one's competency cannot be left alone because you can't travel. So how do you do it? That's where things like virtual reality training gets pushed in. So
thank you, David. Mark.
David raises some really excellent points, and I think it's going to be interesting to see what are the real lessons people take out of this, particularly government agencies that have been potentially caught off guard by their lack of communications, their robustness in the systems to deal with cyber. And now that international travel's been restricted, how do they keep those contacts going with their key partners? I really liked what Don and Sandy had to say about where the club's going, where the first world club's going. What concerns me is what's happening to those that aren't in the club, what's happening in the third world countries. Will there be that discretionary amount of expenditure being allowed to occur? And I think one thing that offsets that, certainly in our region, that we're starting to see now is the way China has behaved initially to the defensive approach they took, because people were putting forward the blame game on them, and now they're taking quite an aggressive attitude in what they're doing, and now people are starting to say, hey, enough's enough. And we haven't really been that vocal in the past, so there's almost two pulls, isn't it? It's people looking after themselves economically. It's what are you going to do as part of a partner in your region, and how are you going to collectively work together against the threats that are clear and present at the moment.
Now we'll turn to more harder security-related issues. When looking at international relations and security generally, we've been focused almost exclusively on external factors, whether in the form of threatening moves by Russia, the People's Republic of China, North Korea, and Iran, or by non-state actors such as Muslim terrorist groups and their fellow travelers. But now our struggle with COVID-19 has exposed deep social fissures in all countries, democratic and despotic. We only have to look at the Black Lives Matter protests in the US, as well as that country's suboptimal response to COVID-19, to see that not all is well with the American Republic. Has COVID-19 internalized the way that we now look at security? Mark, would you like to have a crack at that one first?
I think that sort of follows on to what I was saying earlier. And I think the initial response is going to be look after yourself. But as we start to realise that the solutions can't be done internally, the alliance is going to be really important depending on what country you're from. Certainly the Five Eyes community, I think, will become stronger as a result of this, because they need to. It's about information sharing. It's about learning the lessons that we've that we picked up out of Iraq and Afghanistan, and a strong alliance is much more powerful than trying to do it alone. Clearly, the results of the US election are going to be really important to see what happens in places like Korea and Germany with troop movements. But I think the general view, certainly in the senior US military, is those contacts, those relationships are inherently important to security and stabilisation.
John.
Yeah, but thanks, John. David knows me. I take a very simplistic view, and I try and take a local view. Yeah, I think one of the downsides that's going to come out from a security perspective, both locally, nationally, and internationally, is the ability to interact with people. You know, 80% of my engagement is, 50 years in this business, is getting to know people, trust, respect, acknowledgement. I've been cocooned for 3 months, and these Zoom calls and other calls, but I welcome Mark and other people. We built, I accept what David's saying about virtual engagement and cyber engagement, but a lot of our security world, whether it be military, police, enforcement agencies, or whatever, is on trust, respect, negotiation, and contact. And we're not making those new contacts, and they're going to go stale for a while. A lot of people will change their profile, because the working profile will change, but that social interaction within our world of security. And I've never met a senior or junior or baseline security person who hasn't said, I know Don Randall, I know John, I know Sandy, whether it be from 40 years ago, they still remember. And it's that trust and build up. And that's a piece that I think is going to miss, because we're going to have a vacuum there, and it's going to be a long time before that travel will work its way around, period.
Don, I think you raise a very excellent point. And actually, going back to what David was saying about the virtual space, having lived and worked in the Middle East myself, I know that as an expat, I used to, like every other expat who lived in the Gulf, get really frustrated with local authorities' control over communications, which meant, the voice over protocol, the VoIP kind of structures. We weren't able to call back home, or if we did, you'd have to go through some guy who knew how to tunnel through their system in a very Byzantine way. So if, for instance, those restrictions are still pretty much in place in the Gulf, how would it be for Gulf countries to then overburden themselves with bandwidth problems in the virtual capacity, for virtual training, which is going to gobble up whatever's left of bandwidth in the Gulf, I would imagine. David Kay?
Yes. So in terms of the restrictions that were in place in the cyber world, I can't really comment as to why they're there and whether they'll remain there or not. But what we did see over the last 3 or 4 months is easing up of platforms that enables businesses to conduct their daily operations remotely or virtually. Things like Zoom, Microsoft Teams, approved platforms were in fact embraced and allowed to go forward. I feel that the Gulf countries have a good capability in terms of the bandwidth, etc. But in terms of having that control that was in place, it was more so you've got to understand that places like the UAE, even though there is a lot of businesses here, it's also a very transient place, meaning that a lot of people that come here to come and work and play. And in the play part, they kind of abuse the social media platforms that's accessible to them. It's a simple case of, when in Rome, do as Romans do. They, having lived here for the past 12 or 13 years, there's a lot of expats from the Western countries that come here, but do not have that due respect that a Muslim democratic society will expect, or you've got to give it. So I think these were measures that they had to put in place in order to be able to get people to conduct themselves in a socially acceptable manner. I think moving forward with having to have interactions that requires more cyber capability, things will change. But this goes back to also a point that I wanted to explain, is that what we seem to have done, and there's a lot of people here on this call more qualified than me, but having done the analysis on the effects of COVID-19 on national security, is the minute that this COVID-19 actually hit the space in terms of people getting sick, you had hundreds of organizations running to find a vaccine for this disease. Now, what this did, this also hit the security apparatus of societies, or the security elements, or our defenses. Going back to also what Don was saying as well, it's the terrorist cells haven't gone to sleep. They're still there. They haven't disappeared. COVID hasn't won. They're just trying to figure out how they're going to behave in a COVID-19 world, if you like. What we haven't done as national security agencies and defense agencies started to work on a vaccine. How do we counter that? Obviously, everything that we had in place pre-COVID-19 to defend ourselves against transnational serious organised crime, terrorism, cybersecurity issues, etc. I'm not saying it's irrelevant, no, but they need updating, and they need updating a lot quicker. But we're not even having that discussion yet. Nobody's even come out and gone, hold on a minute, let's have a look at what's happening here and how do we come up with that vaccine. So again, true to our word, I think we're behind the 8 ball. So we're just sitting and waiting. Let's see how the terrorists, for example, attack, and then we'll try and come up with a solution. I think that's probably incorrect. We should also be looking for a vaccine on how to deal with post-COVID-19 terrorism and transnational serious organised crime.
I think David's not wrong. David Khandan's not wrong. But we need to, the terrorist and serious organised crime, transnational or local, haven't gone away. And, you know, if we go back to the early days of Al-Qaeda, you know, the cyber element was always one of their objectives. They just went for the more physical and have continued to go for the more physical. And COVID-19, by virtue of people's social distancing, people's social awareness, people avoiding people, you know, people are more observant now because COVID's caused them to be observant, more cautious. So it could be we drive the terrorists into the cyber attack environment by virtue of COVID-19. And the point I made to David the other day on a call, separate calls, as we adjust because of COVID, and if you come to London now, the pathways are being widened, the roads are being narrowed, yes? There's various types. So we mustn't forget the infrastructure we put in place, which was geared to the pathways being narrow and the roads being wide. In other words, the CCTV, the ANPR, the angle of the cameras, all the stuff. So as we drive forward, rapidly drive forward with these methods to keep society safe from COVID, we have to be cognizant of what we put in place to be counter-terrorist deterrence, prevention, investigations as we move. And we have to be very cognizant of the cyber threat from a terrorist activity. Because as we know, when the various cyber attacks that have been state-driven are highly effective in dismantling organizations. You know, cyber can be highly efficient. If you go back to the early days of animal rights, John, you know, the easiest thing animal rights could do was just cut the communication wires. But instead, they put thousands and thousands of fax messages through to block the system. But if they just cut one wire, they would cut the system off. So there's a lot of activity which is simple. But the one good favour is it's not emotional. And, you know, terrorism is emotion. And therefore, the cyber is not emotional because its impact is it's not hurting people physically. So we still, you know, we don't want people to be hurt physically, but it is actually something they want to do. They want to show what can occur through physical activity versus cyber activity. But I personally believe that we will see greater serious organised transnational and terrorist activity in the cyber environment taking a higher profile.
Well, Don, if I could just say something here. I mean, I read somewhere this morning that the Maldives and Mozambique have been hit by ISIS recently. So I suppose, you know, they haven't quite given up on their kinetic strike capacity either. You know, they're just looking for the weak spots. And you're absolutely right. I mean, our counterterrorism measures are forming a form of deterrence. Our greater situational awareness because of COVID has also raised public awareness of what's going on around them in ways that we didn't do before. So perhaps that's a good thing for us. But we have to be forever vigilant because these guys, they will go to ground and they will come up in unexpected ways. Now, David, sorry, go on.
and the technology, just look at the business technology. You know, heat-sensitive cameras, people advancing their cyber for access controls so they can actually restrict people coming. There's a all these restrictions, are being reduced and they're being put in locally, which makes, the terrorist reconnaissance harder to achieve. It doesn't mean to say they can't achieve it, it just makes it harder. And therefore they will look for soft targets, alternative methodologies. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, for sure. Gentlemen, I think that we need to have a little bit of a chat about the World Health Organization and how it responded to COVID. What are opinions? If I can start off with Mark, were you overwhelmed, underwhelmed, or anything between?
Well, I think clearly it's well recognised, the World Health Organization were pretty slow to declare COVID a pandemic. A number of countries reacted well and early, and I think it caught them off guard, and it's really damaged their reputation. I think now they're very much in line with what's and taking necessary action, but I think it's going to hurt them greatly, particularly what the US have done in terms of removing their funding. But I think that's this is something that was very hard to predict. They didn't want to scare the global population, and I think more holistically, we are all far better prepared to deal with whether it's another wave or something very similar, because the protocols have now been established that a lot of, particularly first world countries, never had. So, we could argue for a long time about the merits of what the WHO actually did, but I think we're all in a better position now.
Actually, it's funny you should say that. I recall that just prior to the pandemic being called, I was on radio, the ABC, and the lady who was interviewing me was really pushing the idea of me declaring it a pandemic on air. Now, having done a lot of commentary over the war on terrorism, I'm very sensitive to the fact of, I don't want to instill public fear beyond what was already going on. The toilet the aisles in the supermarkets were bare of toilet paper. We already saw the beginnings of panic, and I thought at that time that if I were to use the pandemic word, it would just do nothing to help people really understand the gravity of what was being faced. And then, of course, as life would have it, the following day the pandemic was declared. But it's one of those things. Who and the way that they went about their thing. Well, I mean, it's a bureaucracy, and like all bureaucracies, they're very slow to respond. And I suppose in many ways they also were very concerned with what are they going to divulge to the public? How will it have meaning for people who don't really understand what this whole pandemic issue is all about? So, yeah.
Well, of course, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. If they called it early and nothing had happened, they would have been criticised. In Australia, they were predicting 50 to 150,000 people were going to die from the pandemic. Well, widely off. So every country has experienced, very different activities on the ground, and I think you've just got to take a balanced approach. And if you're slow to react, you paid a price. If you're quick to react, you were in a pretty good state. But it comes back to comments that David Kay made. A lot of the death from this pandemic has resulted from underlying health issues that haven't been dealt with for a long time by many of the health systems. Yeah.
David Kay, you want to have a crack at the WHO?
No, I'm not one to have a crack at anybody. People in glass houses. But look, if I'm looking at it from a business perspective, from a security perspective, I think, look, for as long as I said, it's hard for me to claim to know much about security in this audience when I have such qualified people on the call. But one of the biggest reasons for a security incident to take place is always complacency. And I feel that the COVID-19, as I said earlier during the call, shook us up in a way that globally we haven't been shaken up, at least in this generation anyway. And it really shook every element of our societies. And when it comes to security, it will make us think differently. And the positives can come out of it. Like the world taught us a lesson. we were getting complacent in the way things were, whether it was counter-terrorism measures, transnational serious organised crime, competency-based training, and the list goes on. I think positives will come out of it, things will be different. And maybe one of the biggest things that we have learned is that you can't become complacent and say, well, look, you know, the health of elderly people, well, we'll just put them on medication and you know, they'll be right. That can't be the case anymore, is that you've got to manage the issues because they can't just disappear or sweep them under the carpet.
Sandy? Sandy and then Don, sorry.
Yeah, so on the WHO, I think there was a mismatch of expectation between the world, who had pretty much ignored the WHO for a long time. It was raised as a name, I suppose, during the recent Ebola epidemic, and perhaps was seen to be, you know, managing okay under those circumstances. And then with COVID, clearly a totally different level of response required. Yeah, so I think the people's expectations of the WHO were perhaps a little bit at odds with the reality of what the WHO was as an organisation. I think for all organisations and nations, there's going to be a very interesting and necessary lessons identified, lessons learned process to come. And it'll be interesting to see how that changes the form and function of the WHO and how it changes the form and function of various other organisations in the perspective of this sort of event. I think maybe one of the changes that's going to happen is people are going to look again at the sort of policy decisions around stockpiling for what are already identified as number one threats, but then end up suddenly falling down to the bottom of the pile when it comes to making decisions on stockpiling. So, and I would say PPE is probably one of the things where it was an easy policy decision to make, to say, yeah, okay, under the worst circumstances, we need this amount of PPE, but we can always buy it. So let's only stockpile a little bit of it. Maybe the but we can always buy it is something people will now look at and say, we can always buy it if we have the means of making it and getting it to where it needs to be. But maybe those sorts of decisions will change. And I think if one looks into the security world, the just-in-time delivery of enough ammunition to have a conflict, somebody's going to look at some of that decision-making and policies, and maybe come up with some different answers for the future there as well.
Yeah. Don?
Yeah, it backs into what Sandy was saying, really. But I think the two learnings, I tend not to be critical of government and international organisations, but maybe make observations. Some might call critical. I think the continuity planning, we've got to, as Sandy said, we didn't have enough. We'd all these exercises, and it dropped to the bottom of the pile. It's never going to happen. And I was talking to a senior medical person the other day, and I mean this respectfully for those who've sadly died or are seriously ill. This is not a killer virus in its own entity, right? It's a virus that kills because of other complications, albeit some people have died as a direct result. But it's not a killer disease in its own right. And when the killer disease in its own right emerges, as it may well do, that's a different ballgame. That's not the elderly or those with underlying health issues. It's something. So it's almost, and the analogy I used the other day, and it's a very UK analogy, it's like local authorities who stockpile salt or don't stockpile salt, and it gets to February and we've had a mild winter, so they don't stockpile the salt. Then we have a harsh March, April, May, and they don't have enough salt to salt the roads to do the defrosting. It's a fine balance, but I think what it's shown the world is that this is going to happen again, and we need to be better planned for it. We need to be united, whatever organisation it is that brings us together. But absolutely with Sandy, the business continuity here, the finding that balance. And okay, we did it with the flu, didn't we? With Tamiflu and all that stuff. And I think at the Bank of England, we still got some stockpiles of Tamiflu stuff. But, you know, that's a lost lead that we have to take. And I think that continuity planning in most countries was behind the curve in the pandemic environment. That's my view.
Mark and then Tim.
Just following on from that, I think what I've certainly found in conflict and also response in emergency services is it's good for the first year or two after that event. But if you've got a new event or you get hit harder than you've expected, you will always be caught out. And I think what is going to be the test in a lot of countries is what is their level of resilience in terms of their planning, their stockpiling, to cater for something at the right level. And every country is a little bit different, but you do have that complacency that will come in year 3, 4, 5, where people just won't remember what happened, or they won't remember how severe it was. So I think that's probably going to be the hardest thing to deal with as we move forward.
Tim.
Well, I know David would be agreeing with both what Mark and Don just said, and would probably point out that if this virus, and I've heard him say this before, if this virus had the kind of deadly capability of something like Ebola or SARS or MERS, in things we've seen in relatively recent history, that and had the contagion, whatever, of COVID-19, that we would be in a much worse position. While there have been many kind of commentators who have mentioned how well Australia has come off in this situation by comparison to places like the UK or the US, for instance, it's not comparatively because of good leadership. It's been very lucky that's the way that we've come off in all of this, and it has been relatively, and again, I mean no disrespect, as we've said, it has been relatively lucky that deaths and kind of economic impact even has not been as bad as it could have been, considering how much this virus has spread. Many people have come out of it and are A-okay. So, and people can be carriers without even having any symptoms. So, in that sense, it's been a wake-up call, and it's been a positive one. But and that's a cause for celebration in terms of, we can now deal with things better in the future, and we know exactly what we need to address. And that is in the public sphere, where podcasts like this can help people know what they need to demand of their governments. But it hasn't highlighted good leadership. I'll put it that way. And that's, I think, kind of reflects what David would point out.
David Kay.
Just one of the points that I wanted to raise again from what we have actually seen is, as what Sandy was saying as well, in terms of stockpiling when it comes to defence organisations, etc., or organisations that are working in remote areas. One of the things that personally really surprised me is that the basic enabling platform for COVID-19 is lack of hygiene or access to basic hygienic items. Now, what really surprised me is how does a defence base doesn't have enough stockpile of liquid soap or a hand sanitizer, for example, to be used in portable toilets, etc. So I think that one thing that it has probably taught our defence agencies is that it's okay to have budget cuts, but it's not okay to have budget cuts when it comes to basic sanitary items or hygiene. I mean, this is what our soldiers should have had access to anyway. It should have been there. It shouldn't have been the case where COVID-19 hits, the base gets locked down, you go and open up the storage area and there is no soap or enough to see you through for 2 weeks till it can actually get there. So it'll change the attitude, I feel, of our defence and national security agencies for the better, that the men and women in uniform that are actually spending their lives defending us will have access to basic things that it should have been there anyway. So again, it'll make people think that budget cuts are okay, but probably not where you need to have some liquid soap for somebody to wash their hands, which is just basic hygiene anyway.
I'm wondering, David, how much of that has to do with the economic model that we've grown to know and love for the last 20 odd years. This whole notion of neoliberal capitalism, the notion of just in time, it's been mentioned before. These things really have conspired to a great degree to not make countries respond in a manner more efficient than they otherwise would. Would that not be a correct assumption here?
It hit us in ways that no one ever thought. I'll make you an example. I have some friends here that are pilots, etc. If you go back and look at the news towards the end of last year, especially the last quarter, there was all this talk, even in Australia, everywhere on the news, about how there's a global shortage of pilots. Mm-hmm. I mean, can you even imagine? Who would have thought that you would have so many pilots being laid off in the last 3 months? Now, there's a global oversupply of qualified pilots. So it has hit us in ways that we didn't think. So the reason I raised that point is that one of the gaps that this highlighted was a gap in the supply chain, particularly when it comes to air freight. So our supply chain system, it was very much reliant on sea freight because we had time for everything. You could deal with 3 weeks, 4 weeks of something to get from point A to point B on a ship. But the urgency that COVID-19 brought on was that everything went on to air freight, and now there's a global shortage, for example, on air cargo planes. And how do you deal with that? So again, I think we were very complacent in, we have time. If something hits us, we'll deal with it. COVID-19 is clearly showing that no, events can take place that you don't have time. So you've got to find a balance where you're sufficiently, you can self-sustain for a couple of weeks or a month at least until supplies get to you. So things will definitely, I hope we have woken up globally. I think Sandy's got his hand up, so I'll go quiet.
Sandy.
Yeah, so a lot of what's been said in the last sort of 5 conversations has made me think that it's made me think about Africa. Africa at the moment has got fewer deaths than Belgium. The whole of Africa, fewer deaths than Belgium. Now, why is that the case? And is this something? What's going on? If one looks at the figures for each of the individual African countries at the moment, they are still on an exponential curve going upwards. And there is a question as to why that is. Is it they're increasing their testing on an exponential basis, and therefore they're increasing their number of people that they're finding on an exponential basis? Is it that there is something different about Africa? But either way, there is a need for the international community to think about how they deal with Africa and what support goes to Africa over the next 6 months. As we said right at the beginning of this conversation, we're beginning to come out of our COVID lockdowns, etc. We're finding our way forward in a very hesitant way. And I think it would be a real mistake for the global north, if that's the right way of putting it, to ignore what's happening in other parts of the world as we concentrate on our own recovery. And so I would say, for looking to Africa, they've jumped in many ways with other events, technological events. They jumped the copper telephone system and went straight to mobile. We should be able to enable them, to help them to jump over some of our early mistakes and to respond to what's happening in their country in a different way. And that might be, for instance, by bringing in antibody testing in huge numbers into African countries so they get a better feel for what's actually happened in their country than we have been able to give ourselves, given that our event happened before theirs.
Interestingly enough, David and I were having a discussion about Africa and COVID, and I did say that the available evidence seems to be that Africa's dodging a bullet here. You know, when you look at the collective COVID cases, they're very, very small. But I suppose testing has always been a problem in many parts of Africa. They don't have enough equipment. They can't test enough people most of the time. But then there's also the other thing that David raised, and it was the comorbidity issue. I mean, Africa's got a relatively young population. So you would, and even the older people, they kind of live a very hard life. I mean, they live a life that, would give them plenty of physical exercise in ways that, people out here in the West simply don't have. So in what way would Africa's youth bulge have contributed to a lower COVID overall number?
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I mean, if one looks at the population charts for Europe, they're pretty much diamond shaped with lots of elderly people and not much youth. If one looks at the population charts of Africa, they're pretty much pyramids, with not much in the way of elderly people, but lots and lots of youth. So I think there are two aspects of that. A very large number of relatively healthy youth, because if they weren't healthy, they die with much shorter life expectancies. There are many much earlier deaths. I've been to many funerals in Ethiopia of people who just don't die at that age in our countries. So I think a younger, healthier population is being affected differently. But I think there is an onus on us to help our African neighbors to work out what is the difference and what do they need to do about it. Because to quote a friend in Kenya, he said, in Europe, you are locking down in order to save your health service. We don't have a health service here. What we have to do is to save our economy, because that is what provides health to our people. So there's a real danger, I think, of Africa being encouraged to follow what we did when it may not actually be appropriate. And so I'd go back to this issue of understanding what is happening in Africa better. And I think that's something where we collectively can help. And maybe the WHO is particularly one of the organizations that can help across Africa with that. I think one of the things that talking about the sort of rules-based international order, international organizations, one of the organizations that I think has come out of this having shown interest, and I think effective interest in its members, is the African Union, who have clearly and worked with the countries to think about what to do. So I think, again, for the international community, there are international organizations like the WHO and like the African Union, through whom one can help the African nations better understand what's going on.
And let us not forget the other,
save their economies.
Let us not forget the other elephant in the room, China. They must be providing some sort of support to both the African Union and to the states on a bilateral basis, yeah?
Yeah, they are. But I think this is where there's a danger of it being seen as a competition, when in fact it should be seen as an obligation to assist. Not let's assist because if we don't, China will get there in front of us. But let's assist alongside all other nations, and that includes China, to help Africa get to where it should be. Because if Africa were to effectively destroy its economy in order to save some people who weren't going to die, there is going to be a much greater problem further on down the line.
Yeah. Mark?
I was just going to reinforce Sandy's point about his example compared, the populations in Europe, you can't compare to Africa. What we are seeing, though, and I mentioned a little bit earlier, are those very youthful countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand. They're surviving this really well. So I think there are already lessons to be taken out of that. If they don't have great health systems, so a lot of those communities have been distancing themselves. The problem you're going to get is those high population areas, the refugee camps, will go through that like wildfire. So, I think there needs to be a degree of proactivity here, and there are, we've got testing regimes that allow you to know within 15 minutes of whether you are asymptomatic or not. So I think those are the sorts of things where partnering with the World Health Organization can be very proactive in countries that haven't been greatly affected but have the potential to be.
Tim?
On this point, I guess we're talking about nations that have relatively, like you were, so we're talking about nations that have younger populations or majority young population, which kind of has the consequences of a generation, let's say, that is going to be or growing up or has just witnessed both the global financial crisis and now the kind of COVID-19 crisis in their lifetimes, and how, if that ends up being the majority of these nations' population, how that might affect the civil unrest, I guess, within their own countries, if they're experiencing shut off from other countries now that they had significant trade with, that's possibly causing them issues now. How much is the kind of, I guess, the old status quo just not fulfilling for some of these countries, I guess, is my question. Do you think that that's something that we can predict about the future, that is specifically kind of young populations who have known nothing except, I guess, unsatisfactory economics? I mean, you're already talking in developing countries. Is it going to change, I guess, the trajectory of these countries, do you think? Open question.
Yeah, let me have a think about that. So yeah, I think this is one of the dangers of leaving Africa to follow us effectively, rather than helping to lead them through what is in some way a different, but I say in some way, in an unknown way at the moment, a different event for them. I think 5 years down the line, it will be possible to look back and see that there was something different happening, and one needs to do a little bit of sort of what you might call strategic foresight, and look and see how to lead them, to help lead them to where things are going to work for Africa and for the relationship between Africa and the rest of the world. We need Africa as much as Africa needs us, and I think there is a big opportunity out of this to really develop a better economic relationship between Africa and the rest of the world. And again, this is where I think, working with the African Union, one can level the playing field a bit between the two in trade terms.
Sandy, I have a question, and that is, this year is going to be an election year for Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy. How do you think he has fared so far? And has his handling of COVID-19 been competent? How would Abiy's re-election affect the Horn of Africa?
Well, I think the first point on that is that part of the handling has been to declare a state of emergency. That state of emergency has pushed the election back. So the election is very likely now to be in 2021 rather than in 2020. Although I think from his public statements, Prime Minister Abiy would like still to hold the election this year, but that's not going to be possible under the current circumstances. So I think it's interesting to see that he has followed the lead in a way of Prime Minister Meles in being a bit of a spokesperson for Africa. Relatively easy to do, as the African Union is on his doorstep, as it were. Easier for him to do than for some other African leaders. So it's been interesting to see Ethiopia sort of step up a little bit to that international plate. I think internally, the delay in the elections has caused some concern from the opposition as to where their opportunity is going to come to take part in a democratic election. If it's not going to be this year, then where are the guarantees around it being next year, etc. But I think from Prime Minister Abiy's point of view, he's looking for a way ahead that is constructive and takes Ethiopia through his continuing transformation, as he calls it, and takes them via an election into a different political place. But I think, maybe I've said this previously on a podcast with you, Ethiopia is in very macro terms, is at a point of deciding whether it wants to be one country or several countries. It's the only empire in the world that has remained as a country, gone from being an empire to a country. All of the others have broken up into individual countries. I feel Ethiopia is going to remain one country, but the tensions that are being seen at the moment are those tensions around how do we manage moving from an empire to a country. The Constitution of 1994 was a step in that direction, but it wasn't a perfect step. It could never have been. And like nearly all constitutions in the world, it will eventually be amended. There will be amendments, or there will be a sort of redrafting of something. Inevitably, it's going to happen. But I think Abiy's process of transformation in a very difficult political setting, difficult on his own side with the Prosperity Party, and difficult amongst and between and with the opposition, is, it's not one we would wish on ourselves.
Yeah. Look, I think what we'll do is we'll come to a close by asking Mark a big question on Australian strategy. Mark, what of the state of the Asia Pacific? Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and Taiwan are seen as countries that have rebounded in some way from COVID-19. Here in Australia, the Morrison government has taken cautious steps to reopen the national economy, but our relations with key economic partner China have been damaged by Canberra's insistence on making China accountable for its lamentable handling of the initial COVID-19 outbreak in Wuhan. With China weaponizing its economic ties to Australia, fighting a trade war with the US, taking a harder line against Hong Kong, and also in the South China Sea, what do you think this will mean for Australia and its regional interests in the near term?
It's a pretty simple question, isn't it, John?
Well, yes. I saved the best till last.
I think China is making Australia squirm a lot at the moment.
Yeah, it sure is.
And I think what Australia's got to do is be the adult in the room. They've got to stand up. They don't need to overreact, because China is treating many other countries, US is seeing it right now, in very much the same way. I think what we need to be doing, particularly within our region, standing up, doing the right thing. That doesn't mean necessarily going against China, but it comes to that point I was raising earlier about the discretionary funds that we've got in our aid programs. The reality is they are not really discretionary. What we've got to do is maintain what we're doing. We've got to keep that personal contact going. So when travel is allowed to occur, we've got to keep the political, the military contacts up with our regional partners. And that goes as far as, South Korea as part of our alliance responsibilities. So I think it's going to be the difficulty that we will experience. 30% of our trade plus comes in and out of China. We're going to have to be very careful how we handle this matter. We have seen that we need to maintain a degree of independence as we go through, and we haven't seen that in our over-reliance to a degree on China. I think it's about finding the right balance. So that's probably going to be the key going forward, finding the right balance and maintaining a strong relationship with our regional partners and leading, using some proper leadership.
Anyone else want to have a crack at that one? David?
I absolutely agree with Mark. I feel action must be taken. However, overreacting is not the way forward. Definitely following the rest of the world is not the way forward. As Australia, we're in a different sphere as everybody else. So when everybody's jumping up and down and saying what they're saying about China, it doesn't just mean that Australia needs to follow suit automatically. It needs to think for itself and put Australia and Australians first. I sound like Donald Trump a little, but I think that's that's how it's got to be. And we need to do what's best for our people. And we need some smart decision makers within our government, and fingers crossed we have them there.
Okay, gentlemen, that's a wrap. Thanks for joining us today and for sharing your insights on STRATEGIKON. And to our audience, thanks for listening. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to STRATEGIKON through the Ozcast network, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. And please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course on the Sage International Australia site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. Also, if you would like to support STRATEGIKON, remember to check out our merch page. We have a wide variety of items to keep the STRATEGIKON listeners satisfied. Until next time, goodbye.